Welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is where I get to chat with people who I've connected with over the years in the world of arts and entertainment, and this is yet another installment of our Guitar Talk series, and I'm so glad to have back with us, to talk guitars, David Henman. Welcome back, David.
Hey, Tommy, how you doing?
Well, I'm doing great. So, we've talked a few times in the past about the music business and about your career and so on, and today we're going to get down and dirty with the guitar talk. So, I'd like to go back to the early days with you, David, and let's get back to what inspired you in the first place and how you started out as a kid on the guitar.
Yeah, actually, where it really begins is, and this is, I'm sure, not that different for other guys of my era, is the Everly Brothers. When you first heard the Everly Brothers on the radio in the 1950s, and into the early 1960s, it was really the 1950s, was those two acoustic guitars. They got a sound that was just, it really it had an impact, that sound. And my brother and I were both just blown away by it. We would stand on our front porch when we were like 11 years old with a broom and a rake pretending they were guitars. We'd stand there trying to sing Bye Bye Love and wake up little Susie. But that was the first time that the sound of a guitar, I think, really we had heard country and western songs and pedal steel and so on, but that was the first time I think that it hit us full on. So that became a fascination. Then I took guitar lessons, which I guess there was kind of a play by number. My parents bought me an acoustic guitar with a Hawaiian painting on it. People from that era will remember those guitars. I guess you got them from Sears, and they had a painting of a beach and a palm tree or something like that on them. And I took lessons that was kind of, I guess, by number. There would be a number on the fretboard of where you put your finger, and we were learning songs like Red River Valley and My Darling Clementine and, so on. But that's not the music we were hearing on the radio. So I quickly, we went to some dingy little room in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where some old guy was teaching us, how to do this play by number thing. I got bored with that very quickly. I just stored the guitar in the closet, went back to playing hockey, and that was it until I reached the age of 15.
We should point out for the listeners that what you're talking about playing by number is actually tab.
It's probably tab. Yeah, I guess that's still in use today, but it just didn't work for me, And then, like I say, a number of years later, I was 15, surf music came along. And that, I think, really took hold. So then it was a matter of getting an electric guitar.
Cool. Now, you mentioned the lessons and so on, and that to me, as a kid, that would have been luxury because I started to learn how to play guitar by watching TV. Like I actually used to play along with the Tommy Hunter show and the Ed Sullivan show.
Yeah, I think we might have taken it for granted. As a matter of fact, around that same time when my brother and I were around 10 or 11, my parents offered us the opportunity to take piano lessons. And it was in the little village that we lived in, things like piano lessons, music lessons, and dancing lessons were unheard of. I wish I could have a redo on that. I'd go back and take those piano lessons and take those bloody dancing lessons too. But anyway, fast forward to 1962 and surf music and Hank Marvin in particular, the Ventures, and I got an electric guitar. It was an Ibanez guitar that was, I guess, a bit of a take on a Les Paul or a similar design. I wish I could find that guitar again. I've seen Ringo Starr. You'll see pictures of Ringo Starr when he was playing with Rory Storm from that era. He had, I think Rory Storm owned the guitar, and Ringo was the drummer, but he would spell the singer, Rory Storm. He'd come up from behind his drums and play that guitar and give Rory a break on the vocals. That's the only place you can go into Ibanez archives and find that guitar. It's not easy to find, but it's if I ever stumble across one in a yard sale, I'll definitely grab it.
Ibanez has always built quality guitars, and I'm sure you know the story about their about Gibson suing them successfully because basically the Ibanez Les Paul was really a Les Paul, spec by spec.
Ah, interesting. That may be the reason for its demise. Around that same time, I used to go to see bands. We'd go to the local dances at the Legion, for example, or the church halls and things like that, and go to see bands or the bands that played at the schools, high schools, and so on. And I'd go with a bunch of guys, and they'd all be like looking for girls to dance with, but I'd be glued to the bandstand. I'd be standing by the bandstand watching where the guitar player put his fingers. And then I'd run home that night and try and figure out what he was doing, why he was putting his fingers in this spot. The big breakthrough when I was at a music instrument store one day and I saw a chord book, a chord manual, and that was my musical training. I found a chord manual which showed me how to make chords, and that was really when things sort of got off the ground.
Well, that's interesting you mentioned watching guitar players live and trying to figure out what they were doing with their fingers when you got home, because there's an interesting story about when the band Van Halen started out, and Alex Van Halen famously told Eddie, when you do your finger tapping, turn your back. We don't want other guitar players to learn your trick.
Yeah. Well, with me, the reason I did the watching is I wasn't born with an ear for music. Now, over a period of 65 years, 70 years, I have developed a bit of an ear.
Well, that's interesting. Back to Ibanez, when we shared a stage at the Rockin' for Kids 2020, I was standing beside you playing an Ibanez. I have an Ibanez AR250 that I bought it roughly, it was 2014, and it still had the factory inspection sticker on it. So I think they're still afloat.
I wouldn't mind owning an Ibanez. There's one, the sort of SA style Ibanez. They're extremely lightweight guitars. And I keep looking on Kijiji. I might find one of these days.
Who knows? Yeah. It sounds like you're about to get to the point where you're a teenager and you're getting into the surf guitar and watching other guitar players for influence. And now you've got a chord book. And where do we go from there?
Yeah, I think the next big, we learned our Chuck Berry songs in the early days. You learned your Chuck Berry songs and early Rolling Stones. And we tried to learn the Beatles. Some of the more musically astute among us could figure out those Beatles chords, and everybody else would just sort of follow along because the Beatles chords were more complex than your basic Chuck Berry tunes and so on. But, really the next big thing was that British invasion. And I think the first, trying to think who would have been the first big influence on me, were certainly Procol Harum with Robin Trower. But of course, I never learned how to get that sound until, probably a couple decades later.
Quick editor's note here about Robin Trower's signature sound and tone. Robin Trower was known to plug into a Marshall amplifier from back in the 60s era, vintage Marshall amplifier, going through a Univibe pedal that was originally designed to emulate a Leslie speaker. And it ended up sounding something like a cross between a chorus and a flanger and phase shifter. Anyway, back to the show.
Probably the big one at that point in time was probably Pete Townsend, first of all, with his rhythm style. I think I really, at some point, glommed onto that rhythm style, the windmill style, and the big chord, that big E chord. That would have been a biggie. And the next one, which, a lot of people other guitar players will often pick this up in my playing, was Peter Frampton. Because, we were all playing the blues in that sort of minor major mix-up that with the blues, you never really know if you're playing in a minor scale or a major scale, and you can only really tell by ear, and I don't have much of an ear. But for me, Peter Frampton kind of broke that open, where, a lot of his melodies were in that major scale, where you could play that major third over a major chord kind of thing. That was a bit of a break for me. So that really, to this day, you can hear a lot of that Peter Frampton major third scale type of thing in my playing. As any guitar player can tell from listening to it right now, I'm not a sophisticated guitar player. I've never learned how to read music. And this takes you to another area. I've never practiced the guitar. And some will be shocked at that, and others will nod their head and go, yeah, I get that. Everybody follows their own path in music. And, I don't believe there's any right or wrong, and I'm a firm believer that one size does not fit all. There are, in fact, a lot of very, very famous guitar players who never learned to read music and don't practice the guitar.
Well, it's interesting to think about top shelf guitarists actually not practicing, and we can get back to your point in a minute. And Robin Trower. Now, I read an interview with Robin Trower some years ago where he said that he was having a lot more fun playing guitar before he learned what he was doing. In other words, it was a lot more fun for him before he learned the actual rules around musical theory. He was having a lot more fun just jamming out before he knew there were rules. And I should just point out that you're talking about Peter Frampton during the Humble Pie days, right? This is before the breakthrough with Peter Frampton Comes Alive, obviously. Peter Frampton would have been definitely playing with Steve Marriott and Humble Pie in the 1960s during your formative years, although I'm sure that Peter Frampton Comes Alive impacted you back in the day when that came out, just like it did the rest of us.
Yeah, although the Frampton Comes Alive was where I think that was the jumping off point when I first heard, and I think it was Frampton Come Alive, were those solos.
Really? Because by the time Peter Frampton Comes Alive came out, you already had your time with April Wine and were established as a member of the Dudes with Bob Cigarini. So you had many years of experience as an established guitar player behind you before Peter Frampton Comes Alive came out.
Probably. Well, I mean, I was in a successful band. I'm not a guitar. I mean, other guitar players seem to enjoy my playing because it's a bit close to the edge. I don't know what I'm doing. And that's true of a lot of guitar players who are improvisers. And it does create a bit of interest because, you know that when you're watching the guy, he's winging it. For me, that's fun to watch.
It's interesting. I recently read an article where Ritchie Blackmore talks about guitar players that are too perfect. He talked about how he's not a big fan of Steve Morse because he doesn't play any wrong notes. And I mean, when you listen to Jimi Hendrix, Jimmy played a lot of wrong notes.
Yeah, a Canadian counterpart to that would be Rick Emmett. I have a huge respect for Rick Emmett, but when I've seen him perform, I get the impression he's practicing. It's like, you don't get the feeling that he's going to fall off the cliff at any second, where, guys like, I don't know, anybody from Peter Townsend, anybody, they play pretty close to the edge. Even Eddie Van Halen, I mean, there's so much spontaneity and humor in his playing. I mean, certainly he knows his way around the fretboard well enough that he's probably not going to hit a bad note, or if he does, you're not going to notice it. But I tried doing studio work. It felt like I was in class. It felt like I was in school. I'm just not that kind of player. And thankfully, in the music world, there's room for all kinds of players, and I'm eternally grateful for that. To me, it's not a competition. Everybody can follow their own path. I can enjoy the Ramones in equal measure to, say, Steve Morse or Chet Atkins or Richie Kotzen or Eddie Van Halen or anybody else you can name. I can enjoy, Kurt Cobain or Chuck Berry or Keith Richards in the same breath as, say, Julian Bream or Tommy Emmanuel. That's the wonderful thing about art, is that there's just so many, from people beating rocks together to, Glenn Gould at the piano. There's all kinds of room in the middle.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned that early on, your first guitar was the Sears guitar with the Hawaiian painting on it. And I do recall seeing some of those around back in the day. But I'm wondering, was there kind of a stepping up from that to something of a better quality acoustic guitar, or did you just go electric from there?
There was a little brown acoustic guitar that I don't know where it came from. I don't know if we, but it was a guitar that I used to take. I worked on a farm when I was 15. Took that guitar with me and used to sit on under a tree playing that song "Summertime" and "The Living Is Easy," and which is such a beautiful song. I could barely get through it. I would become so choked up. So I had that little brown guitar, and that was my stepping stone to electric. And once I got on electric, of course, everybody in Nova Scotia, and the bands in Nova Scotia, played Fender guitars, especially those sunburst Fender Stratocasters. So I went on a quest to buy a Fender guitar, and my mom was still young to have any money, so my mom bought me first, I think it was either a Fender Jaguar or Fender Jazzmaster, and then a Fender Telecaster. But these were, for a kid like me, these were complicated instruments, and I never really figured them out and foolishly sold them. And actually, I don't remember what I played after that. I do know that here's an interesting story for you. I was living in St. John, New Brunswick, and I would have been about 17 or 18 years old. And there was a music store owned by this guy, Joe, and he had a Les Paul sitting by the cash. And it was like, he said it was like a 59 or a 60, like a cherry burst Les Paul with patent applied for pickups, PAF pickups. And I was in the store one day and I said, Joe, I'm moving back to Halifax. And he got up and he took this guitar off the stand and he handed it to me. And he said, David, I want you to have this guitar. Funny thing is, I hadn't really shown any interest in the guitar. I guess I maybe looked at it when it was sitting there on the stand just because it was a guitar. And he handed it to me, and I thanked him, but I never really bonded with the guitar and got it back to Halifax, formed a band, and we needed a sound system. And this Les Paul with the baseball bat, thick neck on it, and it was heavy, and it would slide off your knee when you tried to play it sitting down. So I put it up for sale, and some kid from a surf band in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, showed up on his scooter and handed me $250 and strapped it to his back because it didn't have a case, and off he went. I remember my brother saying to me, boy, David, I don't think you should have sold that guitar.
You mentioned a Fender Jaguar and a Les Paul in the same breath, more or less. And then you were talking about not really being a session player, but you did some pretty good session playing on my cover of your song, Drop Your Guns. And I think that the difference is I didn't coach you or tell you what to play, but you did some brilliant slide playing. And then you played most of the guitars on that, but I did play one part where I'm just droning the chords, and I played it on a Fender Jaguar, of all things. And the reason I was playing the Fender Jaguar was because I went into the studio with a Les Paul Standard that was loaned to me by a friend who really wanted me to play his guitar in studio. But that Les Paul simply would not stay in tune. So the engineer grabs a Fender Jaguar off the wall, and I thought, my God, this is a beast. It was huge. But if you listen carefully to our cover of your song, Drop Your Guns, you can hear me playing just drone chords on a Fender Jaguar.
Cool.
Yeah, so there must have been some older kids or other guys in the neighborhood who influenced you as a player when you were coming up.
Actually, there was a band in Nova Scotia. They're known around the world. They were called, I think first they were called the Beavers, and then they were called the Great Scots. As the Beavers, they had mohawk haircuts. And then as the Great Scots, they wore kilts. They actually made it in the U.S. They appeared on one of the big, maybe Dick Clark's bandstand, I'm not sure. But they were a band, to this day, they were way ahead of their time. And the guitar player, Bill Schneer, lived in my little village of Timberley, and I used to go see him all the time. He had these beautiful Gretsch guitars, and he had mastered the Chet Atkins style of playing. He had a huge influence on me. He became sort of a mentor. He taught me a magical chord, which I've used a billion times. It's an A minor chord that I've used a million times as my magic chord. But yeah, he was a huge influence on me. I should also tell you about my first gig. It was an interesting, I wasn't ready to perform yet, but, we had started hooking up with other musicians from the other little villages around. And I got a call one day saying that the guitar player in this band that was doing a show couldn't make it and could I fill in? And I had never done a gig. But I kind of knew the local repertoire at the time was Wilson Pickett and, Midnight Hour and so on and so forth. So I kind of was familiar with the song, so I thought I'd give it a go. It was funny. It turned out to be, this is in Nova Scotia in the very early, I guess it would be around 63, which was still, a fairly racist environment. And the show that I was doing was in a place called Windsor Junction, a little black settlement. And the drummer and I were the only white people. It was kind of a dance in the church hall kind of thing or something like that. There I showed up, got picked up by a black guy with his white girlfriend in a convertible. And off we went to the gig. I mean, no surprise. Of course, me and the drummer, only white people there. We were treated like royalty, of course, which the opposite would have been had it been the reverse of the situation. I remember I made, I think, $6.27 or something like that was what I made. And my fingers were bleeding because I had, it was so early in the span of things, I hadn't learned how to change guitar strings yet. So I was using these strings that were covered in rust. So by the time, I think by the third song, my fingers started bleeding. That was my introduction to performing.
Straight into the fire. Yeah, it's interesting because my first paid gig was a wedding at a little community center in Bonfield, Ontario. And I was paid, I think it was $13.50. And that would have been around 1976. So,
you're a younger lad.
Yeah. Well, I'm old enough to be your kid brother.
Yeah.
Yeah. So first gig, I'm guessing it was, from the sounds of it, was a bit torturous for you, but you were treated like royalty. So I'm sure they had some salve or something to fix it up for you. And what happened after that?
We formed this band, my brother and I, and another local guy named David Hayes. We formed this sort of three-piece band with my brother playing drums and David and I playing guitars plugged into a Silvertone amplifier. We were doing mostly surf music. We were doing, Walk, Don't Run and Pipeline and so on and so forth. And we wanted to perform. First of all, we called the band the Chantes. There was a band out of California called the Chantes who had a hit record with Pipeline. And we didn't know you couldn't use another band's name. We thought, oh, that's a cool name, so we want to use it too. So we called ourselves the Chantes. I still have our business cards from that era. So we went looking. We did a couple of you do like a high or a school pageant. We performed on stage at our local school, things like that. But when we went out to try and actually get a paying gig, they said, oh, you don't have a singer. You need a singer. So we went looking for a singer, and we found this guy named Sonny. I forget his last name, but his name was Sonny, and he looked the part of a singer. He wore a sports jacket, and he had the haircut. He had the Hollywood hair, and he sang things like, the Midnight Hour and, whatever other R&B. R&B was big, of course, in Nova Scotia and Halifax at the time. Most of the songs you did were R&B songs. Can't remember what else you would have done at the time. Anyway, this guy, Sonny, came along, and he had a microphone. We plugged the microphone into the Silvertone amplifier along with the two guitars. And, of course, all you got out of that was distortion. But it was enough. So we did a couple. But it was very strange because that was back in the era when the band and the singer were two separate entities. You always had the singer, and they had his backup band, Of course, that all changed when the Beatles came along. I mean, Buddy Holly and the Crickets kind of signaled it was a portent of what was to come. But the Beatles changed everything when they came along. It was like, oh, the guitar player could be the singer, the drummer could be the singer, the bass player could be the singer. And hey, you can write your own songs. That was as you know, the world changed when the Beatles showed up.
Yeah, they sent out a hypnobeam from the Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964 to all boys and girls, and we were all convinced that we had to pick up guitars and drums and whatever and get into bands.
That's right, and every band since then owes a debt to the Beatles. Every band.
Isn't that crazy?
They created the rock and roll band. They weren't the first, but they were the ones who wrote the book.
Well, like you say, there was the idea that you didn't have to have just a lead singer, that everybody could be the lead singer. That had to be a big part of it.
Yeah, and you could write your own songs.
Yeah, that was pretty much unheard of. I mean, Buddy Holly did, but Elvis wasn't writing his own songs.
No.
Frank Sinatra before that wasn't writing his own songs.
Yeah.
What were you playing for a guitar at this point in time?
I probably played that Ibanez for a long time, and I would have played the Jaguar, and I would have played the Telecaster, but I don't really remember. At some point, I got to look at photos of back then to see what I was playing. I don't recall if there was some point in April Wine, for example. We formed April Wine. There was a band before April Wine called Prism. I think that's where I discovered the Gibson SG. Pretty sure I was faithful Gibson SG player on and off for about a decade there, from, say, sometime in the mid-'60s, well into the '80s, so maybe for a couple of decades. On and off, I became an SG player. I remember seeing pictures of the band Prism. Again, there was a famous Canadian band called Prism, but they were formed after the fact.
At the time that you guys were called Prism, the band that the world came to know as Prism was called The Seeds of Time. And we're getting into some pretty interesting stuff here, and it sounds like we're going down the road toward April Wine. And I really want to talk about that, but I'd like to save that for part 2. So for now...
That sounds good. Yeah.
Cheers.
All right. I'll see you in part 2, Tommy.
Well, I certainly hope you are enjoying part 1 of Guitar Talk with David Henman. Be sure to check out part 2. I'm glad to have David as a friend. Now here, from his current project with his life partner Rose, Henman Rose Side Road, is Sail Away. Enjoy.
You felt the wind, you felt the sun, but you never felt free. You hide away, melancholy days, all those nights when you are in need, and the heavy sighs and the heavy eyes and the writing on the wall and the warning signs and the grand design and the shouting in the hall. Sail away, sail away, Sunday morning, sail away, sail away, sail away, catch the rhythm, sail away. Here comes our ride to take us where there's no morning and no night. It's a 3-month stay, and we'll hide away and write our stories, tell the lies, and when they come to save our lives, we'll be ready if we survive. We'll sell our pain, we'll trade our souls, and say we're happy to be alive. Sail away, sail away, Sunday morning, sail away. Sail away, sail away, catch the rhythm and sail away. Sail away, sail away, sail away, Sunday morning, sail away, sail away, sail away, catch the rhythm, sail.
Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including guest acquisition, recording, editing, and so on. And hey, if you like the show, why not subscribe and help support us through Patreon at patreon.com/TommySolo. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a clip from my original composition, The Burn. All rights reserved. And you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks for listening, and until next time, cheers.